Detective Maria Evelyn Lopez held the anonymous letter in her trembling hands, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill. After 34 years of haunting silence, someone finally knew what happened to Adam and Aaron Hill. The letter contained details only the killer could know. Details about two 7-year-old boys who vanished from a campsite on a humid Georgia night in 1990. The writer claimed their neighbor, Clark Edward Bowman, had confessed everything on his deathbed, including the exact location where he'd buried the evidence that would finally bring justice to the Hill family. Maria's heart raced as she read the coordinates, knowing that within hours she could be standing at the site that held the answers to one of Georgia's most heartbreaking mysteries. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The evening of June 14th, 1990, started like any other summer Friday for the Hill family. Robert and Catherine Hill had been planning this camping trip for weeks, excited to take their twin sons Adam and Aaron to Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area for a weekend of fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows under the stars. The boys, identical twins with matching sandy blonde hair and bright green eyes, had been practically bouncing off the walls with excitement for days. Catherine had packed their favorite snacks, peanut butter sandwiches, juice boxes, and enough cookies to feed a small army, while Robert checked and rechecked their camping equipment, making sure they had everything needed for a safe and comfortable trip. They arrived at the campsite around 4:30 that afternoon, the Georgia sun still high and hot in the cloudless sky. The location they had chosen was popular among families, a designated camping area along the riverbank with established fire pits, picnic tables, and enough tree coverage to provide shade from the relentless summer heat. Other families were scattered throughout the camping grounds, the sounds of children laughing and playing, mixing with the gentle rush of the river, water flowing steadily past smooth rocks and overhanging willow trees. Adam and Aaron helped their father set up the tent, though their assistance consisted mostly of running in circles around Robert while he hammered stakes into the hard ground and struggled with the tent poles. Catherine watched them with a smile, her camera ready to capture every moment of what she believed would be a perfect family weekend. She snapped photos of Robert pretending to chase the boys, of Adam and Aaron making silly faces at each other, of the four of them standing together in front of their blue and yellow tent with the river visible in the background. By 6 o'clock, Robert had started a fire in the designated pit, and Catherine was preparing hot dogs and beans for dinner. The boys sat on a log near the fire, poking at the flames with long sticks they'd found in the woods, debating which constellations they'd be able to see once darkness fell. Adam wanted to spot the Big Dipper, while Aaron insisted they'd find Orion, even though Robert had gently explained that Orion was a winter constellation and wouldn't be visible during summer months. The family ate dinner as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. Other campers nodded hello as they walked past on the nearby trail, some heading down to the river to fish in the cooler evening hours, others returning to their own campsites to settle in for the night. Catherine remembered waving to a young couple with a toddler, and Robert recalled seeing an older man with a distinctive limp walking a brown and white beagle along the path that ran parallel to the river. After dinner, the boys begged to explore the area near their campsite before it got too dark. Catherine hesitated, but Robert assured her it would be fine as long as they stayed within eyesight and didn't go near the water without supervision. The river, while beautiful, had a deceptively strong current in certain areas, and Robert had already warned the boys multiple times about the dangers of getting too close to the edge without an adult present. Adam and Aaron ran off together, their matching red t-shirts bright against the darkening landscape as they searched for interesting rocks, pine cones, and anything else that 7-year-old boys might find fascinating. Catherine watched them from her folding chair beside the fire, occasionally calling out to make sure they responded, her mother's instinct never quite allowing her to fully relax, even in what seemed like a perfectly safe environment. Around 7:45, as twilight deepened into dusk, Catherine called the boys back to the campsite for s'mores. Robert had the graham crackers, chocolate bars, and marshmallows laid out on the picnic table, ready for what the twins had been talking about since the moment they had learned they were going camping. Catherine called once, then twice, her voice carrying through the warm evening air. When the boys didn't immediately appear, she stood up and called again, louder this time, a small flutter of concern beginning to take root in her chest. Robert joined her, walking toward the area where they had last seen the boys playing near a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards from their campsite. He called their names, his deep voice echoing slightly in the growing darkness. Silence answered him back. Catherine's concern escalated to worry as she began walking faster. Calling for Adam and Aaron, her voice taking on an edge of panic that she tried unsuccessfully to suppress. They searched the immediate area, calling and calling, their voices growing hoarse and desperate. Other campers heard the commotion and came to help, forming an impromptu search party that spread out through the campground. Someone had the presence of mind to call the park rangers, and within 20 minutes, uniformed rangers arrived with flashlights and radios, coordinating a more systematic search of the area. By 9 o'clock, the local police had been notified, and additional officers arrived to assist in the search. Catherine was nearly hysterical by this point, sobbing and calling her sons' names over and over, refusing to believe that they could simply vanish in such a short period of time. Robert, pale and shaking, gave the police a description of the boys, identical twins, 7 years old, sandy blonde hair, green eyes, both wearing red t-shirts with blue jeans and white sneakers. He provided recent photos that Catherine had taken earlier that day, images of two smiling boys who looked so alive and happy that it seemed impossible they could be missing. The search continued throughout the night, with volunteers from nearby communities joining the effort as word spread about the missing twins. Helicopters with searchlights flew overhead, their beams cutting through the darkness as they scanned the dense woods and the river's edge. Bloodhounds were brought in, following the boys' scent from the campsite, but the trail seemed to disappear near the main road that led into the recreation area, as if Adam and Aaron had simply ceased to exist at that particular spot. As dawn broke on June 15th, exhausted searchers had found nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no evidence that the boys had drowned in the river, despite extensive searches of the water and the banks downstream. It was as if they had evaporated into the humid Georgia air, leaving behind only frantic parents and a growing sense of dread among everyone involved in the search. Detective James Crawford was assigned to the case that morning, a veteran investigator with 22 years of experience and a reputation for thoroughness. He interviewed Robert and Catherine separately, trying to get a clear timeline of events and any details that might provide leads. Both parents insisted that their sons had been happy and well cared for, that there were no custody disputes or family conflicts that might explain a parental abduction. They had no enemies, no one who would want to hurt them or their children. Crawford expanded his investigation to interview other campers who had been in the area that evening. The young couple with the toddler remembered seeing the Hill family earlier in the day, but hadn't noticed anything suspicious. The older man with the beagle, identified as retired postal worker Frank Henderson, recalled walking past the Hill campsite around 7:30 and seeing the boys playing near the trees, but he'd been focused on his dog and hadn't paid much attention to anyone else in the area. As the investigation progressed, Crawford learned that Clark Edward Bowman, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from the Hills in their suburban Atlanta neighborhood, had been camping at the same recreation area that weekend. Bowman, a 42-year-old divorced man who worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, had checked into a campsite approximately a quarter mile from where the Hills had set up their tent. When questioned, Bowman stated that he'd been alone at his campsite most of the evening, cooking dinner and reading a book by lantern light. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, and expressed shock and sympathy when told about the missing boys. Crawford found Bowman's presence at the same location suspicious, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. There was no physical evidence linking Bowman to the disappearance, no witnesses who had seen him near the Hill campsite, and no clear motive for why he would want to harm the twins. Bowman consented to a search of his vehicle and campsite, which yielded nothing incriminating. He also agreed to a polygraph test, which he passed, though Crawford knew that polygraphs were far from infallible, and that some individuals could beat them through various means. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The massive search effort gradually wound down, as it became clear that Adam and Aaron weren't going to be found wandering in the woods or floating in the river. The case shifted from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation, with the working theory being that the boys had been abducted by someone who had been at the campground that evening, someone who had seen an opportunity and taken it during the brief window when they were out of their parents' sight. Robert and Catherine's lives became a waking nightmare. They appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for information, begging whoever had taken their sons to return them safely. Catherine's face, ravaged by grief and lack of sleep, became familiar to everyone in Georgia as the story received extensive media coverage. They put up flyers with the boys' photos, offering a reward of $50,000 for information leading to their son's safe return, money they'd borrowed against their house and received from donations by sympathetic strangers. The Hill home became a shrine to the missing boys. Catherine refused to change anything in their bedroom, keeping their beds made, their toys arranged exactly as they had left them, their clothes hanging in the closet waiting for the day they'd come home. She celebrated their birthdays every year, baking cakes and singing happy birthday to sons who weren't there to blow out the candles. Robert tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, going to work, paying bills, but the light had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a haunted look that never quite faded. Detective Crawford continued investigating, but leads dried up quickly. Tips called into the hotline proved to be dead ends, either well-meaning but mistaken individuals who thought they'd seen the boys, or cruel hoaxers seeking attention. Crawford kept circling back to Clark Bowman, interviewing him multiple times over the following months. But Bowman never wavered from his story. He'd been alone at his campsite, hadn't seen the boys, knew nothing about their disappearance. Bowman's background check revealed nothing particularly alarming. He'd been married for 8 years before divorcing in 1986, no children. His ex-wife, reached by phone in Florida where she'd moved after the divorce, described him as emotionally distant and controlling, but not violent. She hadn't stayed in contact with him after leaving Georgia and seemed genuinely shocked to learn that he was being investigated in connection with missing children. Bowman's employment record was solid, his supervisor at the manufacturing plant describing him as reliable and competent, if a bit antisocial. Coworkers said he kept to himself, ate lunch alone, never joined them for after-work drinks or company social events. Neighbors on his street characterized him as quiet and private, someone who maintained his lawn and kept to himself, not friendly but not hostile either. Nothing in his past suggested he was capable of harming children, but Crawford's instincts told him that Bowman knew more than he was saying. By 1991, the case had gone cold. Crawford was reassigned to other investigations, though he never stopped thinking about Adam and Aaron Hill. The file remained open, but with no new leads and no evidence, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. The FBI had been consulted early on, but without proof that the boys had been transported across state lines. Their involvement was limited to providing resources and expertise to the local investigation. Robert and Catherine's marriage crumbled under the weight of their grief. They divorced in 1993, unable to move forward together when so much of their shared life was tied to the sons they'd lost. Catherine moved to South Carolina to live with her sister, while Robert stayed in the Atlanta area, changing jobs and addresses multiple times over the years, but never quite escaping the shadow of that terrible night in June. Clark Bowman continued living his quiet life, moving to a different neighborhood in 1994, changing jobs in 1998, but always staying in the greater Atlanta area. If he knew what had happened to the Hill twins, he never said a word to anyone. He avoided his former neighbors on the rare occasions he encountered them, kept an even lower profile than before, and seemed content to let the years pass in anonymity. The case became one of those tragedies that communities remember but gradually stop talking about. New crimes occurred, other children went missing, and while Adam and Aaron Hill were never completely forgotten, they became part of the past, 2 more victims in the long history of unsolved cases that haunt law enforcement and break parents' hearts. Detective James Crawford retired in 2008 after 40 years in law enforcement. The Hill case remained one of his greatest regrets, a failure that he felt personally, despite having done everything possible with the resources and evidence available. He kept a copy of the case file at home, occasionally reviewing it during his retirement, hoping that some detail might suddenly make sense. Some connection he'd missed might reveal itself after years of percolating in his subconscious. Maria Evelyn Lopez joined the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit in 2015, 25 years after Adam and Aaron Hill disappeared. She'd been drawn to law enforcement specifically because of cold cases, fascinated by the challenge of solving crimes decades after they'd been committed. using new technologies and fresh perspectives to find answers that had eluded previous investigators. Maria was assigned the Hill case in 2018 as part of a systematic review of unsolved child abduction cases from the 1980s and 90s. She spent months familiarizing herself with every detail, reading thousands of pages of reports, interview transcripts, and witness statements. She tracked down and re-interviewed everyone who had been at the campground that night, now older by nearly 3 decades. Their memories faded, but their sympathy for the Hill family still intact. She found Catherine living in Charleston, working as a receptionist at a dental office, still unmarried, and by all accounts still mourning her sons as intensely as she had 30 years earlier. Catherine kept photos of Adam and Aaron everywhere in her small apartment, age-progressed images showing what they might look like at 37, faces that existed only in imagination and digital rendering. She broke down when Maria arrived to discuss the case, simultaneously grateful that someone was still trying to find answers and terrified of what those answers might reveal. Robert had passed away in 2016 from a heart attack, dying without ever knowing what happened to his boys. Catherine said he'd never recovered from the loss, that it had slowly killed him over the course of 26 years, destroying his health and his will to live. She showed Maria photos of Robert from before the disappearance, a robust man with a ready smile, and then photos from later years, gaunt and haunted, a ghost inhabiting a body that refused to give up until it finally did. Maria located Clark Bowman living in a modest ranch house in Marietta, working as a property manager for a small apartment complex. He was now 76 years old, his hair white and thin, his body bent with age and what appeared to be significant health problems. When Maria showed up at his door with questions about a camping trip in 1990, Bowman's expression barely changed. He repeated the same story he'd told Detective Crawford 3 decades earlier, his tone bored and slightly annoyed at being bothered about ancient history. Maria tried multiple approaches, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes confrontational, but Bowman never budged. He knew nothing, had seen nothing, and deeply resented the implication that he'd had anything to do with the disappearance of his former neighbor's children. He told Maria that the investigation had ruined his life, that people had whispered about him for years, that he'd lost friends and job opportunities because of unsubstantiated suspicions. He demanded that she leave and not come back unless she had an actual warrant based on actual evidence. The case seemed as unsolvable in 2018 as it had been in 1990. Despite advances in forensic technology, there was no physical evidence to analyze. The case file contained no hair, fiber, or biological samples that might yield DNA results. There were no security cameras in the recreation area in 1990. No cell phone records to subpoena, no digital footprints to follow. It was a crime from an analog era, and the lack of modern evidence made it nearly impossible to crack using modern techniques. Maria refused to give up. She spent her off hours researching Clark Bowman, building a comprehensive profile of his life before, during, and after the Hill twins' disappearance. She discovered that Bowman's ex-wife had made allegations of emotional abuse during their divorce proceedings, claiming he'd been obsessively jealous and controlling. She found that Bowman had been questioned in connection with a series of burglaries in his neighborhood in 1988, though he'd never been charged due to lack of evidence. She also learned that Bowman had been camping at the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area numerous times before the Hills' visit, that he knew the area extremely well, and that he'd specifically requested the same campsite for the weekend of June 14th through 16th, a campsite that was relatively isolated and positioned between the main camping area and a rarely used service road that connected to a state highway. Maria became convinced that Bowman was guilty, but conviction without evidence was worthless. She needed something concrete, something that would hold up in court and finally give Catherine Hill the closure she deserved. Maria reviewed every inch of the original investigation, looking for anything Crawford might have missed, any avenue that hadn't been fully explored. In March 2024, as Maria was reviewing the file for what felt like the 1,000th time, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a blocked number, and when she answered, a woman's voice, elderly and shaky, asked if this was the detective working on the Adam and Aaron Hill case. Maria confirmed her identity, her heart beginning to race with the sudden hope that, maybe, finally, this was the break she'd been waiting for. The The woman identified herself as Joyce Bowman, Clark's younger sister. She said she was calling because Clark had died 3 weeks earlier from complications related to lung cancer and congestive heart failure. She apologized for not calling sooner, explaining that she'd needed time to process what her brother had told her during his final days. Her voice cracked with emotion as she explained that Clark had made a deathbed confession, telling her everything about what happened to the Hill twins. Maria's hands trembled as she grabbed a pen and notepad, her mind racing with questions, but she forced herself to stay calm and let Joyce speak at her own pace. Joyce said that Clark had been eaten alive by guilt for decades, that it had made him bitter and isolated, that he'd carried the secret like a poison that slowly killed him from the inside out. She said he'd refused to tell the police directly because he couldn't bear the thought of going to prison, but he also couldn't bear to take the secret to his grave without someone knowing the truth. According to Joyce, Clark had seen the Hill family arrive at the campground on June 14th and had immediately fixated on the twins. He'd always wanted children, but his ex-wife hadn't, and after the divorce, he'd become increasingly obsessed with the idea of fatherhood, of having sons who would care about him, who would visit him in his old age, who would mourn him when he died. When he'd realized his former neighbors were camping nearby with their young boys, something had snapped inside him. Clark had watched the family throughout the evening, noting their routines and their camping setup. When he'd seen the boys playing alone near the trees as dusk fell, he'd made a spur-of-the-moment decision that would destroy multiple lives. He'd approached Adam and Aaron, telling them he knew their parents, that their mother had sent him to bring them back to the campsite because it was getting dark. The boys, trained to trust adults and especially adults who claimed to know their family, had gone with him willingly. Clark had walked them to his truck, which he'd parked on the service road out of sight from the main camping area. He'd driven them to his campsite, but once there, reality had crashed down on him. He'd realized the impossibility of what he'd done, that he couldn't simply keep these children, that their disappearance would be noticed immediately, that he would be a suspect given his proximity to the Hills both at the campground and in their neighborhood. Panicking, Clark had made an even worse decision. He'd given the boys sleeping pills crushed into cans of soda, telling them it was a special camping treat. Adam and Aaron had drunk the soda, gradually becoming drowsy and confused. Clark told his sister that he'd intended to keep them asleep until he could figure out what to do, but he'd miscalculated the dosage badly. Both boys had stopped breathing within 2 hours. Joyce was sobbing as she recounted this part of Clark's confession, saying that her brother had claimed it was an accident, that he'd never intended to kill the children, that he'd just wanted to keep them quiet while he thought of a plan. Maria listened in horror, her own eyes filling with tears as she imagined the terror and confusion those 7-year-old boys must have felt in their final hours. Clark had wrapped the bodies in his camping tent and tarps, loaded them into his truck, and driven to a remote area along the riverbank about 8 miles from the recreation area. He'd dug a shallow grave in the muddy soil near the water's edge, buried both boys together, still wrapped in the tent material, and covered the site with rocks and fallen logs to disguise the disturbed earth. He'd then returned to the campground, broken down his campsite, and checked out early the next morning, telling the ranger at the gate that a family emergency had come up. Joyce said Clark had described the burial site in detail, wanting someone to know where the boys were so their mother could finally lay them to rest properly. He'd given Joyce specific landmarks, a distinctive rock formation shaped like a seated bear, a massive oak tree with a split trunk, and GPS coordinates he'd apparently recorded on his phone during a return visit to the site years later. Driven by guilt and some morbid need to confirm that his secret remained buried, Maria asked Joyce if she was willing to put all of this in a written statement, to testify if necessary. Joyce said yes, that she felt obligated to do right by those children and their family, even if it meant admitting that her own brother had been a monster. She agreed to meet Maria the following day at GBI headquarters to give a formal statement. After hanging up, Maria sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what she'd just learned. Then she sprang into action, contacting her supervisor, arranging for a search and recovery team, and beginning the process of obtaining the necessary warrants and permissions to excavate the site Joyce had described. The next morning, Joyce Bowman, a frail 81-year-old woman with white hair and kind eyes, sat across from Maria in an interview room and repeated everything her brother had told her. She'd brought a handwritten letter from Clark, dated just 4 days before his death, laying out his confession in shaky handwriting. The The letter was rambling and self-pitying in places, but it contained details about the crime that had never been made public, details that only the killer could have known. Maria took Joyce's statement, recorded everything on video, and secured the letter as evidence. Then she assembled a team that included forensic anthropologists, crime scene technicians, and cadaver dogs to search the location Joyce had identified, based on Clark's description and coordinates. On April 2nd, 2024, exactly 33 years, 9 months, and 19 days after Adam and Aaron Hill vanished, Maria stood on a muddy riverbank, staring at a distinctive rock formation that did indeed resemble a seated bear. The massive oak with the split trunk stood about 30 yards away, exactly as described. The cadaver dogs alerted almost immediately to an area between the rock and the tree, their behavior leaving no doubt that human remains were present. The excavation was painstaking and respectful, with forensic anthropologists carefully removing layer after layer of soil and decomposed organic matter. About 3 feet down, they encountered deteriorated fabric, the remnants of the tent and tarps Clark had used to wrap the bodies. And beneath that, they found bones, 2 small skeletons lying side by side, exactly where Clark Bowman had left them 34 years earlier. Maria stood at the edge of the excavation site with tears streaming down her face, feeling a mixture of profound sadness and grim satisfaction. The Hill twins had been found. Adam and Aaron could finally go home. The forensic anthropologist confirmed that the remains were consistent with 2 children, approximately 7 years old. Dental records, preserved in the original case file, provided definitive identification. The manner of death couldn't be determined with certainty after so much time, but the toxicology tests that were standard during autopsies in 1990 hadn't been possible since there were no bodies to examine. Now there was no soft tissue left to test, but the positioning of the remains and the lack of obvious trauma to the bones was consistent with Clark's confession about death by overdose. Maria made the call to Catherine Hill on April 3rd, asking if she could come to Charleston to deliver important news in person. Catherine knew immediately what it meant, that after 34 years of not knowing, she was finally going to get answers. She sat on her couch with Maria beside her, holding her hand as Maria explained everything that had been discovered. Catherine's reaction was complex and heartbreaking. Relief that her sons had been found, anguish at learning how they died, rage at Clark Bowman for what he'd done and for robbing her of so many years by keeping his secret, and a desperate, keening grief that seemed to encompass 3 decades of accumulated pain, all hitting her at once. She sobbed for hours, alternating between thanking Maria and crying for her babies who had been alone in the ground for so long. The case generated massive media attention when the discovery was announced. The story of the Hill twins, missing for over 3 decades and finally found through a deathbed confession, captured public imagination and sympathy. Journalists dug into Clark Bowman's life, painting a picture of a deeply disturbed individual who had hidden his darkness behind a facade of ordinariness. Catherine held a press conference, standing beside Maria, thanking everyone who had never given up looking for her sons, and expressing her gratitude that she would finally be able to give Adam and Aaron a proper burial. She looked directly into the cameras and said that while nothing could bring back the years she'd lost, nothing could undo the pain her family had endured. She could at least have the closure of knowing where her boys were and what had happened to them. Adam and Aaron Hill were laid to rest on April 25, 2024, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had never known the boys but felt connected to their story. The small white caskets were placed side by side in a plot Catherine had purchased, with a headstone that read, "Adam and Aaron Hill, beloved sons, together forever. June 14, 1983 to June 14, 1990. Catherine stood at the graveside with her sister supporting her, surrounded by people who had been part of the original search, investigators who had worked the case over the years, and strangers who just wanted to pay their respects to 2 little boys whose lives had been stolen by a man's selfish, monstrous decision. Maria stood nearby, having formed a bond with Catherine through the investigation, feeling like she'd finally fulfilled a sacred duty to bring these children home. The investigation officially closed in May 2024, with Clark Edward Bowman posthumously identified as the perpetrator. Because he was deceased, there would be no trial, no public airing of evidence, no opportunity for Catherine to confront him in court. Some felt this was a cruel twist, that Bowman had escaped justice by dying before being held accountable. Others argued that he'd lived with the weight of his guilt for 34 years, that his sister had described him as a miserable, isolated man who had essentially created his own prison. Maria thought about this question often in the months following the case's resolution. Had justice been served, the boys were dead, their killer was dead, their father was dead, and their mother would carry the scars of this tragedy for the rest of her life. There was no punishment that could balance the scales, no sentence that could undo the harm Clark Bowman had caused. But at least there were answers. At least Catherine knew. In the fall of 2024, Maria received a letter from Catherine. It was handwritten on pale blue stationery, the script shaky but legible. Catherine wrote about how strange it was to finally have closure after so many years of uncertainty, how she visited the boy's grave every week, bringing flowers and telling them stories about her life, about their father who had loved them so much, about all the birthdays and Christmases they'd missed. She wrote that she'd forgiven Robert for not being able to save their marriage, that she understood now how grief could destroy even the strongest bonds. She wrote that she was trying to forgive herself for letting the boys out of her sight that evening, though Maria knew from their conversations that Catherine still struggled with guilt, still played the what-ifs through her mind despite everyone telling her she'd done nothing wrong. Most importantly, Catherine wrote that she was grateful to Maria for never giving up, for treating Adam and Aaron not as cold case statistics, but as real children who deserved to be found and brought home. She said that Maria had given her the most precious gift possible, the ability to say goodbye properly, to know that her sons were finally at rest after spending so long alone in the dark. Maria kept that letter in her desk drawer, taking it out sometimes when she worked on other cold cases, reminding herself why this job mattered, why spending years chasing leads and analyzing evidence and refusing to give up on victims everyone else had forgotten was worth every frustrating moment and every dead end. The Hill case changed Maria in ways both profound and subtle. She'd worked other cases before and after, some solved, some still open, but none affected her quite like Adam and Aaron Hill. There was something about those two 7-year-old boys with their matching smiles, about their mother's unwavering love and hope across 34 years, about the senselessness of how they died that crystallized for Maria exactly what her work was really about. It wasn't about conviction rates or closing cases or getting promoted, though those things mattered. It was about bearing witness to tragedy and refusing to let victims be forgotten. It was about speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves. It was about telling mothers like Catherine Hill that their children mattered, that their lives had value, that someone cared enough to keep searching long after everyone else had moved on. Joyce Bowman died in October 2024, 6 months after her brother's confession led to the recovery of the Hill twins' remains. She'd spent those final months estranged from other family members who couldn't understand why she'd exposed Clark's crimes, why she hadn't just let sleeping dogs lie and preserve the family name. But Joyce had told Maria she had no regrets, that doing the right thing had been more important than protecting a dead man's reputation, that she hoped God would forgive her brother even if she couldn't quite manage to forgive him herself. The Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area placed a small memorial plaque near the camping area where the Hill family had spent their last happy hours together. It didn't mention the tragedy specifically, just commemorated Adam and Aaron Hill and acknowledged that this place held both beautiful memories and terrible sorrow. Some visitors stopped to read it and wonder about the story behind it, while others passed by without noticing, intent on enjoying their own family camping trips, making their own memories. Detective James Crawford, who'd retired years before the case was solved, learned about the discovery from a former colleague who'd tracked him down to share the news. Crawford was 84 years old by then, living in a retirement community in Florida, his health declining, but his mind still sharp. He'd wept when told that the case had finally been solved, that the boys had been found, that Clark Bowman had been the killer all along, just as Crawford's instincts had insisted. He told his former colleague that he'd always known Bowman was guilty but hadn't been able to prove it, that the failure had haunted him throughout his career and into retirement. Learning that he'd been right all along brought him a measure of peace, though he wished he could have been the one to crack the case, to give Catherine Hill answers while her husband was still alive to share in the bittersweet closure. Crawford wrote a letter to Maria, congratulating her on solving a case that had eluded him and expressing his deep respect for her dedication and skill. He said that cold case investigators were special people, willing to immerse themselves in tragedies that had happened before they were even born, chasing ghosts and following trails that had gone cold decades earlier. He said Maria had honored the memory of Adam and Aaron Hill through her work, and that he hoped she understood what a profound difference she'd made in Catherine's life. Maria framed that letter and hung it in her office, a reminder from one generation of investigators to the next that this work mattered, that persistence paid off, that justice delayed was better than justice denied. She thought about Crawford's words when cases seemed impossible, when leads dried up and evidence remained elusive, when she felt tempted to move on to something more solvable. Then she'd look at the letter and remember that somewhere out there, other families were still waiting for answers. Other children were still missing. Other cold cases were waiting for someone stubborn enough to keep digging. The Hill case also led to renewed interest in other cold cases from the same era. Maria received calls from families who'd had loved ones disappear in the 80s and 90s, people who'd been told their cases were unsolvable, who'd given up hope of ever knowing what happened. They wanted to know if Maria could work the same magic on their cases, if she could find their missing family members the way she'd found Adam and Aaron Hill. Maria had to explain that every case was different, that the Hill case had been solved because of a specific set of circumstances, a deathbed confession and a sister willing to come forward, not because of any special technique or breakthrough technology. But she also promised to review their cases, to see if there were any avenues that hadn't been explored, any connections that might have been missed. Some of those cases eventually yielded answers, while others remained frustratingly unsolved. But Maria approached each one with the same dedication she'd brought to the Hill investigation. Catherine Hill gradually rebuilt her life in the wake of finally learning what had happened to her sons. She joined a support group for parents of murdered children, finding solace in connecting with others who understood the specific kind of grief that came from losing a child to violence. She began volunteering with a non-profit organization that advocated for missing children, using her story to raise awareness and funds for investigations. She also started a small scholarship fund in Adam and Aaron's names, providing financial assistance to criminal justice students who plan to specialize in cold case investigations. The first scholarship was awarded in the fall of 2025 to a young woman who'd been inspired by Maria's work on the Hill case, who wanted to help other families find the same kind of closure Catherine had finally achieved. On what would have been Adam and Aaron's 42nd birthday in June 2025, Catherine stood at their grave with Maria beside her. They'd developed a friendship over the years since the boys had been found, bonded by the case that had brought them together. Catherine placed fresh flowers on the headstone, 2 separate bouquets, one for each son, and talked to them the way she'd been doing since they were buried. She told them about the scholarship fund, about the support group, about all the ways she was trying to make meaning from their deaths. She told them she still missed them every single day, that not an hour went by when she didn't think about them, wonder what they would have looked like as grown men, what careers they might have chosen, what families they might have built. She told them she was sorry she couldn't protect them, sorry it had taken so long to bring them home, but that she was glad they were finally together in a place where she could visit them, where she could sit beside them and remember. Maria stood quietly nearby, giving Catherine space for this intimate conversation with her sons, but close enough that Catherine knew she wasn't alone. When Catherine was ready, they walked back to the car together, and Maria drove Catherine to a diner where they'd gotten into the habit of having lunch after these cemetery visits. Over coffee and sandwiches, they talked about life, about Catherine's job and Maria's current cases, about the upcoming holiday season, and Catherine's plans to spend Thanksgiving with her sister's family. They didn't talk about the case anymore, unless Catherine wanted to, which was rarely. The investigation was over, the mystery solved, and while the grief would never completely fade, Catherine was learning to live with it rather than letting it consume her entirely. As Maria drove back to Atlanta that evening, she thought about how strange and profound it was that a case that began in 1990 had finally reached its conclusion in 2024. 34 years during which technology had transformed, multiple generations of investigators had worked the case, and the world itself had changed almost beyond recognition. But some things remained constant across all those years: a mother's love for her children, a detective's determination to find the truth, and the belief that justice, however delayed, was always worth pursuing. The story of Adam and Erin Hill, two 7-year-old twins who vanished from a campsite on a summer evening and weren't found for 3 decades, became a case study in criminal justice classes, an example of how cold cases could be solved even after hope seemed lost. Students analyzed the investigation, debated the ethical implications of relying on deathbed confessions, and discussed the psychological profile of someone like Clark Bowman, who could commit such a heinous act and then live with the secret for the rest of his life. But beyond the academic interest and the media attention and the true crime podcasts that inevitably covered the case, the Hill story was ultimately about family, loss, and the endless human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. It was about a man who made a terrible, impulsive decision that destroyed multiple lives, including his own. It was about parents who never stopped loving and searching for their children. It was about a detective who refused to let a case go cold in her heart, even when it was cold on paper. And it was about 2 little boys who went camping with their family one June evening and never came home. Maria Evelyn Lopez continued working cold cases for years after solving the Hill investigation, earning a reputation as one of the best in her field. She helped solve a dozen other cases during her career, bringing closure to families who had waited 5, 10, 20 years or more for answers. But when people asked about her most memorable case, she always talked about Adam and Erin Hill, about standing at that riverbank when their remains were discovered, about watching Catherine finally lay her sons to rest. She kept a photo on her desk, one that Catherine had given her, showing the twins on the day they disappeared, grinning at the camera in their matching red shirts, excited about their camping adventure, innocent and unaware that they had only hours left to live. Maria looked at that photo often, especially when working on difficult cases, reminding herself why this work mattered, why every victim deserved someone who would fight for them, why giving up was never an option, no matter how cold the trail became. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation eventually used the Hill case as a training example for new investigators, demonstrating the importance of maintaining detailed case files, preserving evidence even when its relevance wasn't immediately clear, and never dismissing a suspect, simply because there wasn't enough evidence for an arrest. The case also highlighted the value of building relationships with victims' families, of treating them as partners in the investigation rather than obstacles or sources of emotional complication. On the 35th anniversary of Adam and Erin's disappearance in June 2025, exactly 1 year after their remains had been discovered and brought home, Catherine Hill gave an interview to a local television station. She looked directly into the camera and spoke to other families with missing loved ones, telling them to never give up hope, to keep pushing for answers, to refuse to let their cases be forgotten. She said that she'd spent 34 years in a horrible limbo, not knowing if her sons were alive or dead, suffering or safe, and that while learning the truth had been devastating, it was still better than not knowing. She said that having answers allowed her to grieve properly, to move forward in a way she never could when Adam and Erin's fate was uncertain, to finally begin healing from wounds that had been kept raw by decades of unanswered questions. Catherine also spoke directly to anyone out there who knew something about an unsolved case but had remained silent, whether out of fear or loyalty, or simply not wanting to get involved. She begged them to come forward, to think about the families who were still waiting, to understand that the information they possessed could change someone's entire life. She said that Joyce Bowman's decision to reveal her brother's confession had given Catherine the greatest gift possible, and that she would be forever grateful to Joyce for having the courage to do the right thing, even though it meant exposing her own family's terrible secret. The interview was watched by thousands of people throughout Georgia and beyond, shared on social media, discussed in online forums dedicated to true crime and cold cases. Several people called tip lines with information about other unsolved cases, some of which led to new investigative leads. The power of Catherine's plea, delivered with such raw emotion and sincerity, moved people in a way that official announcements and media reports never could. Maria watched the interview from her office at GBI headquarters, feeling a swell of pride and affection for this woman who had endured so much, yet still had the strength to advocate for others facing similar nightmares. Catherine Hill had transformed her tragedy into purpose, using her pain to potentially help other families find the answers she'd waited 34 years to receive. It was the kind of resilience and grace that Maria found truly inspiring, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings were capable of extraordinary courage and compassion. As the years passed and the Hill case receded from immediate public consciousness, becoming part of the historical record of Georgia's solved cold cases, the lessons it taught remained relevant. It demonstrated that time alone doesn't make a case unsolvable. That physical evidence isn't always necessary if testimony and confession provide clear answers, and that the dedication of a single investigator who refuses to give up can make all the difference. The case also served as a sobering reminder of how deceptive appearances can be, how monsters don't always look like monsters, how someone can live an outwardly normal life while harboring the darkest secrets. Clark Bowman had fooled his neighbors, his co-workers, and even experienced detectives for decades, maintaining his facade until cancer and the approaching end of his life finally broke down his defenses and allowed the truth to emerge. For Catherine Hill, life continued in the way it does for all survivors of tragedy, one day at a time, mixing moments of genuine happiness with the ever-present undercurrent of grief and loss. She dated occasionally but never remarried, saying that part of her life had ended when Robert died. She remained close with her sister's family, doting on nieces and nephews, finding joy in watching them grow up, even as it reminded her of everything Adam and Aaron had missed. She also stayed in touch with Maria, their relationship evolving from investigator and victim's family member to genuine friendship. They met for lunch every few months, sometimes talking about the case, but more often just enjoying each other's company, two women who had been brought together by tragedy, but who'd found in each other a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. And through it all, through the anniversaries and the holidays, through the moments of breakthrough and the moments of despair, Catherine kept visiting the cemetery where her sons were buried. She brought flowers and told them stories, kept them updated on her life, promised them that they would never be forgotten, that their names and their brief lives would always matter, that she would love them until her own dying breath and hopefully beyond. The story of Adam and Aaron Hill, 7-year-old twins whose disappearance in 1990 remained a mystery until 2024, stands as a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love, the importance of persistent investigation, and the way truth, however long buried, eventually finds a way to surface. Their case was solved not through sophisticated technology or brilliant detective work alone, but through the simple yet profound act of one person choosing to reveal a terrible secret that had been kept for over 3 decades. In the end, justice for Adam and Aaron Hill came too late to punish their killer, too late to save their parents' marriage, too late to give them back the lives they should have lived. But it came nonetheless, bringing closure to a family that had waited an impossibly long time, proving that some cases are never truly cold as long as someone cares enough to keep searching for the truth, and showing that even after 34 years, 2 little boys could finally come home. The forensic anthropology team that had excavated the burial site spent weeks carefully analyzing every aspect of the recovery. Dr. Patricia Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, wrote a detailed report documenting the condition of the remains, the soil composition at the burial site, and the deteriorated fabric fragments that had once been Clark Bowman's camping tent. Her findings corroborated Joyce Bowman's account in every detail, from the positioning of the bodies side by side to the evidence of hasty burial in soil that had been disturbed and then left to settle for over 3 decades. Dr. Chen had worked dozens of cases involving recovered remains, but the Hill twins affected her differently than most. Perhaps it was the photograph Maria had shown her of Adam and Aaron grinning at the camera just hours before their deaths. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that these children had been so close to home, buried within a few miles of where hundreds of searchers had combed the area looking for any sign of them. She treated the excavation with reverence, ensuring that every bone was recovered, every fragment documented, giving the boys the dignity in death that had been stolen from them in their final moments. Maria attended every briefing Dr. Chen provided, absorbing the technical details and translating them into information that would help Catherine understand what had happened to her sons. It was important to Maria that Catherine receive complete answers, not sanitized versions designed to spare her feelings. Catherine had earned the right to know everything, and Maria believed that truth, however painful, was always better than protective lies or strategic omissions. The community response to the case's resolution was overwhelming. The small suburban neighborhood where the Hill family had lived in 1990 organized a memorial gathering at a local park, even though most of the families from that era had long since moved away. Former neighbors who remembered Catherine's desperate searches, who had helped distribute flyers and organize prayer vigils, came together to acknowledge the long-awaited closure and to honor the memory of two boys who had been part of their community for such a brief time. An elderly woman named Margaret Foster approached Maria at the memorial, tears streaming down her weathered face, as she explained that she'd lived next door to the Hills in 1990. She remembered Adam and Aaron riding their bicycles up and down the sidewalk, remembered the sounds of their laughter floating over the fence on summer evenings. She said she'd moved away in 1993 because staying in the neighborhood had become too painful. Every house and street corner holding memories of those bright-eyed twins who had simply vanished. Margaret told Maria that she'd never quite believed Clark Bowman's protestations of innocence, that there had been something off about the way he'd reacted to the news of the boy's disappearance. While other neighbors had been visibly shaken and eager to help in any way possible, Bowman had seemed detached and irritated by the disruption, more concerned about investigators questioning him than about the missing children. Margaret said she'd mentioned her suspicions to Detective Crawford back in 1990, but without any evidence, there was nothing anyone could do except watch and wait. The revelation that Margaret and others had suspected Bowman all along raised questions about whether the case could have been solved sooner if different investigative approaches had been taken. Some criticized the decision to clear Bowman based on a past polygraph test, arguing that more aggressive surveillance or investigation might have yielded results. Others defended the original investigation, pointing out that without evidence or probable cause, law enforcement's hands had been tied by constitutional protections against unreasonable searches and harassment of citizens. Maria found herself in the middle of these debates, defending Detective Crawford's work while also acknowledging that hindsight always provides clarity that isn't available during active investigations. She gave several interviews to criminal justice journals and podcasts, discussing the Hill case as an example of how difficult it can be to investigate cases that lack physical evidence, and how important it is for investigators to trust their instincts while also respecting legal boundaries. One particularly difficult aspect of the case's aftermath involved Clark Bowman's extended family members beyond his sister Joyce. His nephew, David Bowman, reached out to Maria several months after the case closed, struggling to reconcile the uncle he remembered with the monster who had killed two children. David had been 12 years old in 1990, and he remembered Clark taking him fishing occasionally, teaching him to change a tire, acting like a relatively normal, if somewhat distant uncle. David told Maria that he'd been having nightmares since learning the truth, dreams in which he was back in his uncle's truck, wondering if Clark had ever considered doing to him what he'd done to the Hill twins. He questioned every childhood memory, wondering if signs of Clark's darkness had been there all along, and he'd simply been too young to recognize them. Maria listened with compassion, explaining that predators often compartmentalize their lives, maintaining normal relationships with some people while harboring secret compulsions toward others, and that David bore no responsibility for failing to detect something that even trained investigators had struggled to prove. The psychological profile that criminal psychologists developed on Clark Bowman after his death revealed a complex and deeply troubled individual. Dr. Raymond Prescott, a forensic psychologist who specialized in analyzing criminal behavior, wrote a comprehensive analysis of Bowman's life, identifying several factors that may have contributed to his actions. The childless divorce, the social isolation, the proximity to a family with young sons, and what appeared to be an impulsive decision that spiraled catastrophically out of control all played roles in the tragedy. Dr. Prescott's analysis suggested that Bowman likely experienced immediate and profound regret after taking the boys, but his narcissism and self-preservation instinct prevented him from confessing or attempting to make amends. Instead, he'd rationalized his actions, convinced himself that confessing would serve no purpose since the boys were already dead, and built a psychological wall around the memory that allowed him to function in daily life while carrying the unbearable weight of his guilt. The profile noted that Bowman's declining health and approaching death had broken down those psychological defenses, forcing him to confront what he'd done without the comforting delusion that he had years ahead to continue avoiding the truth. His confession to Joyce had been both a plea for absolution and a final assertion of control, revealing the truth on his own terms rather than allowing it to remain hidden forever or potentially being discovered through other means. Maria shared this analysis with Catherine, who read it with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Catherine said it helped her understand how someone could live with such a horrific secret for so long, though understanding didn't equate to forgiveness. She told Maria that she'd fantasized for years about confronting whoever had taken her sons, imagining all the things she'd say, all the questions she'd demand answers to. The fact that Bowman had died before she could face him felt like yet another thing he'd stolen from her. The scholarship fund Catherine had established in her sons' names grew substantially after the case received renewed media attention following its resolution. Donations poured in from across the country, from people who'd followed the case for years, and from those who'd only recently learned about it. By 2026, the fund had grown to over $300,000, enough to provide multiple scholarships annually to students pursuing careers in criminal justice, forensic science, and victim advocacy. The first recipient of the Adam and Erin Hill Memorial Scholarship, a young woman named Rebecca Johnson, wrote Catherine a heartfelt letter explaining that she'd been inspired to become a cold case investigator after learning about Maria's work on the Hill case. Rebecca had lost her own brother to an unsolved homicide when she was 15, and she'd spent the subsequent years determined to help other families find the answers that had eluded her own. She promised Catherine that she would honor Adam and Erin's memory by dedicating her career to seeking justice for victims and closure for their families. Catherine framed Rebecca's letter and hung it on her wall, reading it whenever she needed, reminded that something positive had emerged from the tragedy. She began attending the scholarship awards ceremonies each year, meeting the recipients and hearing their stories, finding purpose and even occasional joy in supporting the next generation of investigators who would carry forward the work that Maria and others had done on behalf of her sons. The Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area saw significant changes in the years following the Hill case. The Park Service implemented new safety protocols, including increased ranger patrols during peak camping season, improved lighting in high-traffic areas, and a comprehensive system of security cameras at parking lots and main access points. While these measures couldn't change what had happened in 1990, park officials hoped they would prevent future tragedies and provide additional tools for investigating any incidents that did occur. The memorial plaque dedicated to Adam and Erin became an unofficial pilgrimage site for people interested in true crime and unsolved cases. Park rangers reported seeing visitors pausing at the plaque, some leaving flowers or small toys, others simply standing in quiet reflection. The Park Service initially worried about morbid tourism, but most visitors treated the site with respect, using it as a place to contemplate the fragility of safety and the importance of vigilance in protecting children. Maria visited the plaque herself on the second anniversary of recovering the boys' remains, standing alone in the early morning before other campers and hikers arrived. She thought about the evening of June 14th, 1990, imagining the Hill family's happiness and anticipation, the ordinary joy of a camping trip that would end in unimaginable tragedy. She thought about all the small decisions and chance encounters that had aligned to create the circumstances for Clark Bowman's crime, the butterfly effect of moment-to-moment choices that had led to such devastating consequences. She also thought about resilience and hope, about Catherine's refusal to give up despite decades of unanswered questions, about Joyce Bowman's courage in breaking her family's silence, about the countless investigators and volunteers and ordinary citizens who had kept Adam and Erin's case alive through sheer determination and compassion. Standing at that memorial plaque, Maria felt the weight of her work, but also its profound importance. The knowledge that what she did mattered not just for solving puzzles, but for healing wounds and restoring dignity to victims and their families. Detective James Crawford passed away in December 2026 at the age of 86, 2 years after learning that the Hill case had been solved. His obituary, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, prominently mentioned his 40-year career in law enforcement and specifically highlighted his work on the Hill investigation. His family requested that donations be made to the Adam and Erin Hill Memorial Scholarship Fund, rather than sending flowers, a gesture that Catherine found deeply moving. Maria attended Crawford's funeral, joining other retired investigators who had worked with him over the decades. They shared stories about Crawford's dedication, his instincts, his refusal to give up on cases even when evidence went cold. Several mentioned the Hill case specifically, noting how it had haunted Crawford throughout his retirement. How vindicated he must have felt to learn that his suspicions about Bowman had been correct all along. How grateful he'd been that Maria had been able to accomplish what he couldn't. Crawford's daughter pulled Maria aside after the service, thanking her for solving the case that had meant so much to her father. She said that during his final months, Crawford had talked often about Adam and Aaron Hill, expressing relief that they'd been found and that Catherine finally had closure. He'd told his daughter that if he had one professional regret, it was that he hadn't been able to prove Bowman's guilt when it might have made a difference, but that he was glad someone with Maria's skill and determination had taken up the cause and seen it through to resolution. The conversation reminded Maria that cold case work existed on a continuum, that investigators built upon the work of their predecessors, that cases were solved through accumulated effort across years and sometimes decades. Crawford had done the foundational work, conducting interviews, building the case file, keeping Bowman on the suspect list when it would have been easier to look elsewhere. Maria had benefited from that groundwork, using it to guide her own investigation and to contextualize Joyce Bowman's confession when it finally came. In 2027, a filmmaker approached Catherine and Maria about creating a documentary about the Hill case. The proposed film would trace the investigation from the night of the disappearance through the eventual discovery of the boys' remains, featuring interviews with investigators, family members, and experts discussing the psychological and criminological aspects of the case. Catherine was initially hesitant, worried about exploiting her son's deaths for entertainment, but Maria encouraged her to consider the educational value of telling the story comprehensively. After much deliberation, Catherine agreed to participate, with the stipulation that any proceeds from the film would go to the scholarship fund and to organizations supporting families of missing children. The documentary, titled 34 Years, The Adam and Aaron Hill Story, premiered at a film festival in late 2028 and was subsequently distributed through a major streaming platform, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. The film was respectful and thorough, balancing the emotional impact of the story with detailed examination of the investigative process. It featured never-before-seen footage from the 1990 search efforts, interviews with Catherine and other family members, conversations with Maria and other investigators, and expert analysis of Clark Bowman's psychology and methods. Critics praised the film for avoiding sensationalism while still conveying the human tragedy at the heart of the case. One of the most powerful moments in the documentary came when Catherine visited the burial site where her sons had been found, standing at the riverbank with Maria beside her. Catherine spoke directly to the camera, describing what it meant to finally know where Adam and Aaron had been all those years, to understand that they'd been together in death as they'd been in life, to be able to bring them home and give them the burial they deserved. Her words, raw and honest and suffused with both grief and gratitude, left few viewers unmoved. The documentary's release generated renewed interest in cold cases, particularly those involving missing children. Tips and leads came in on dozens of other unsolved cases. Some prompted by specific information viewers recognized, others simply inspired by Catherine's plea for anyone with knowledge about any case to come forward. Several of these tips led to breakthroughs in other investigations, creating a ripple effect from the Hill case that extended far beyond Adam and Aaron's story. Maria found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant, invited to law enforcement conferences and university criminal justice programs to discuss cold case investigation techniques. She always centered her presentations on the Hill case, using it as a framework for discussing the importance of thorough documentation, persistent follow-up, relationship building with victims' families, and maintaining open minds about cases that seemed unsolvable. She emphasized that solving cold cases required equal parts analytical skill, intuitive insight, emotional intelligence, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Catherine's life evolved in unexpected ways as she moved further from the immediate trauma of discovering what had happened to her sons. While the grief never disappeared, it became integrated into her identity rather than defining her entirely. She found meaning in her advocacy work, in the scholarship fund, in supporting other families dealing with missing loved ones. She began dating again in her early 60s, eventually developing a relationship with a kind man named Victor, who had lost his own wife to cancer years earlier and understood the complexity of building new happiness while honoring past loss. On what would have been Adam and Erin's 45th birthday in June 2028, Catherine married Victor in a small ceremony at the cemetery where her sons were buried. It felt right to her to begin this new chapter of her life in the presence of Adam and Erin, symbolically including them in her joy, as they'd been included in her sorrow for so many years. Maria attended the ceremony as Catherine's guest of honor, standing beside her friend as she exchanged vows and embarked on the next phase of her journey. The Hill case continued to be studied and analyzed in academic and professional contexts, becoming a touchstone for discussions about missing children investigations, the challenges of cases lacking physical evidence, the role of deathbed confessions in achieving justice, and the long-term psychological impact on families of victims. Law enforcement training programs incorporated elements of the case into their curricula, using it to teach everything from initial response procedures to decades-long case management strategies. Maria retired from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in 2030 after 15 years of distinguished service in the cold case unit. She'd solved 18 cases during her tenure, bringing closure to families who'd waited years or decades for answers. But when reporters asked about her legacy, she always returned to Adam and Erin Hill, to the case that had defined her career and shaped her understanding of what it meant to be an investigator committed to justice regardless of how much time had passed. In her retirement, Maria wrote a book about her experiences investigating cold cases, dedicating it to Adam and Erin Hill and all the other victims who deserved to be remembered and fought for long after the world moved on to newer tragedies. The book became a bestseller, reaching audiences far beyond the true crime enthusiast community, touching anyone who'd ever wondered about unsolved mysteries or felt the weight of unanswered questions. Maria donated all her royalties to the Hill Scholarship Fund, viewing it as a way to extend the impact of the case and to ensure that Adam and Erin's names would continue inspiring positive change for generations to come. Catherine read Maria's book with tears streaming down her face, recognizing her own journey in the pages, seeing her sons remembered not just as victims, but as real children who had lived and been loved, who had mattered then and continued to matter now. She wrote a review that was featured on the book's cover, calling it essential reading for anyone interested in justice, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between mothers and their children. As the years continued to pass, the Hill case remained a powerful reminder that resolution was always possible, that time didn't have to mean the end of hope, that truth had a way of emerging even from the deepest darkness. Adam and Erin Hill had been gone for over 3 decades before they came home, but they did come home. Their story ended not with unanswered questions, but with closure, not with a killer escaping justice, but with his crimes exposed, not with a family destroyed beyond repair, but with a mother who found the strength to build a new life while honoring the sons she would love forever.